This is why the pause before assent is not a minor detail but the central point of control. The impression cannot be prevented, and the interpretation may arise quickly, but the agreement with it is not automatic unless it is left unexamined. When the mind learns to notice this moment, even briefly, it creates space where the interpretation can be questioned rather than accepted. In that space, the original boundary from the previous section becomes usable. The question shifts from "why is this not improving?" to "what part of this belongs to my judgment and action?" This does not remove the difficulty of the situation, but it prevents the addition of unnecessary weight that comes from false conclusions. Without this awareness, the same pattern repeats across days and weeks. Each impression is quickly turned into a judgment, each judgment is accepted, and each accepted judgment adds to the cumulative strain. The person is not only performing care, but also continuously reinforcing a narrative of insufficiency that was never required by the situation itself. Understanding this mechanism does not immediately remove the reaction, but it changes how the reaction is treated. It is no longer taken as evidence of failure, but as a signal that an interpretation has been accepted too quickly. This shift is small in appearance, but it redirects where correction must occur. The mechanism becomes clearer when you observe how a single moment unfolds inside the mind, because the exhaustion is not produced by the act itself, but by what the mind adds to it. An impression arrives first, often quietly, a change in condition, a difficult reaction, a sign that things are not improving. This impression is immediate and not yet a problem, but it rarely remains in that state. Almost without pause, interpretation follows. The mind begins to translate what is seen into meaning. This is getting worse, this should not be happening. I am not managing this well. At this stage, the situation has already shifted from event to judgment, but the shift is not noticed, and so the judgment is treated as if it were part of the event itself. Then comes assent, and this is the decisive point. The mind does not merely observe the interpretation, it agrees with it. It accepts the added meaning as true and necessary, and in doing so, it gives the interpretation authority over the response. What began as a neutral impression is now a confirmed verdict, and the emotional weight that follows is tied not to the event, but to this agreement. From here, action takes shape. The body continues its tasks, but the mind operates under the pressure of the endorsed judgment. The caregiver does not simply respond to what is needed, they respond under the belief that the outcome reflects their adequacy. Each action becomes charged with evaluation, and this transforms ordinary effort into something heavier. Consider a situation where a person provides consistent care over weeks, yet sees no improvement. The impression is straightforward, the condition has not changed. The interpretation adds a layer, this means my effort is not enough. When assent is given to that interpretation, the emotional consequence follows: discouragement, frustration, or quiet doubt. The next action is then performed under that weight, not as a clear response, but as an attempt to correct a perceived failure. The critical point is that the impression did not contain this conclusion. It was introduced and then endorsed. Without that endorsement, the same situation could be approached differently. The condition remains unchanged, but the response is still within one's authority, and its value does not depend on altering the condition itself. Understanding this mechanism clarifies why rest alone does not resolve the exhaustion. A break in activity does not remove the judgment that continues to assign ownership where none exists. Without correcting this judgment, the same burden returns as soon as attention re-engages. This does not mean withdrawing care or reducing effort. It means correcting the standard by which the effort is measured. The value of care lies in the correctness of the response, not in the outcome it produces. When the mind insists on linking these two, it creates a condition where no amount of effort feels sufficient, because the result remains outside its command. A caregiver who maintains this distinction can perform the same actions, prepare meals, provide support, respond to needs, but without attaching their sense of adequacy to the direction of the condition. The work remains, but the added layer of self-judgment begins to loosen. The effort is no longer evaluated against an external movement it cannot govern. Over time, this correction changes the structure of the experience. The same responsibilities exist, but they no longer accumulate into a single continuous weight. Each action is completed within its own boundary, rather than being carried forward as evidence of success or failure. The mind is no longer stretched across past outcomes and future expectations. If this correction is not made, the consequence continues to build. The person becomes not only a caregiver, but also a judge of uncontrollable outcomes, and this second role is what eventually collapses. The strain is not inherent in care itself, but in the misplacement of responsibility that turns care into an endless measure of adequacy. The pressure you feel is not coming from the length of the task, but from the way your judgment has expanded its scope beyond what you can direct. Reduce the scope, and the same work becomes sustainable, not because it is easier, but because it is properly located within your authority. The work appears heavy because it extends over time, but duration alone does not exhaust the mind. What exhausts it is the continuous attempt to carry what was never within its authority. A person caring for a parent, a partner, or a child may begin with simple acts, feeding, organizing, responding, but slowly adds another layer, monitoring outcomes, predicting decline, and silently assigning themselves responsibility for what cannot be directed. This is where the cost begins to accumulate. The body performs tasks, but the mind assumes ownership over progression, recovery, and emotional stability of another person. Each day becomes not only work, but judgment. This should improve, this should not worsen, this should be enough. When these expectations fail, as they often do, the mind records not a neutral outcome, but a perceived failure. Consider a caregiver who adjusts routines, manages medication, and provides consistent attention, yet still watches the condition remain unchanged or deteriorate. The effort remains real, but the result does not follow. If the mind has already linked effort to outcome, then each unchanged result is interpreted as insufficiency. Over time, this interpretation becomes heavier than the work itself. The boundary has been crossed without being noticed. What belongs to the person is the action, the attention given, the choices made, the steadiness of response. What does not belong to them is the condition of another body, the timing of change, or the eventual outcome. When this distinction is blurred, effort multiplies without relief because it is directed toward something that cannot respond to it. The consequence is not immediate collapse, but gradual depletion. Energy is spent not only on tasks, but on managing imagined responsibility. The mind remains engaged long after the action is complete, revisiting decisions, questioning adequacy, and anticipating future problems as if they were already present. This extended occupation of attention creates the sense that the work never ends, even when the body is at rest. You believe long-term care exhausts you because it lasts too long, but the duration is not what breaks you. The burden grows from what you take responsibility for without examining it. The strain does not come from caring itself, but from attaching your effort to outcomes that do not belong to your control, and then holding yourself accountable for their movement. The mistaken assumption is quiet but persistent, that care means managing everything, stabilizing everything, preventing decline, and carrying the emotional weight of another person's condition as if it were yours to resolve. From this, pressure accumulates not because the work is endless, but because your judgment has expanded your role beyond what your authority can sustain. The Stoic principle is simple but exact. Your responsibility lies in your use of judgment, your attention, and your chosen response, not in the condition, progress, or outcome of another life. When this boundary is ignored, effort turns into strain, and strain, maintained over time, becomes collapse. Remove what was never yours to carry. Understanding the mechanism is not the same as being trained in it, and this is where many fail without noticing, because they believe that seeing the error once will prevent its return, when in reality the mind repeats what it has practiced, not what it has understood. Discipline, in this context, is not force applied during moments of strain, nor is it a demand to suppress reaction, but the repeated training of how impressions are received, how interpretations are examined, and how assent is either given or withheld before it hardens into a fixed judgment. Without this training, the mind returns to its previous pattern, especially under pressure, because that pattern has been reinforced through repetition. A person may recognize that they are attaching their worth to the outcome of care, yet when a difficult day arrives, the same interpretation appears again: this is not enough, this should be better. I am failing at this. Recognition alone does not prevent assent, only repeated correction changes the likelihood of agreement. This is why discipline must begin before the moment intensifies, not inside it. Consider how a caregiver might move through a routine day when no crisis is present. There are small impressions, a delayed response, a minor setback, a sign of fatigue in the other person. These moments seem insignificant, but they are the precise locations where training occurs. If each small impression is accepted without examination, the pattern is reinforced quietly, and when a larger difficulty appears, the same unexamined assent is already prepared. Training, then, consists of working within these smaller moments. When an impression appears, the task is not to eliminate it, but to notice it and introduce a brief separation: this is what appears, and this is what I might be adding to it. That separation is the beginning of discipline, because it interrupts the automatic movement toward agreement. This does not require long reflection or elaborate reasoning. It requires consistency. A caregiver who practices this in ordinary moments begins to reduce the speed at which interpretation becomes judgment. The mind becomes less eager to conclude, less quick to assign meaning, and more capable of allowing the impression to remain incomplete until it is examined. Without this, discipline is often misunderstood as endurance, continuing to act despite exhaustion, pushing through without adjustment, or holding oneself to an ideal of constant strength. But this form of discipline does not correct the underlying pattern, it only extends it. The person continues to act, but the same misjudgment remains active, and over time, this leads to deeper fatigue because the source has not been addressed. True discipline is quieter. It does not aim to appear strong, but to become precise. It focuses on the point where the mind decides what something means, and it returns control to that point repeatedly. This repetition is what gradually alters the pattern, not a single moment of clarity or a strong decision made under pressure. It is also important to see that training does not remove difficulty. The condition being cared for does not become easier because the mind has become more disciplined. What changes is the way the mind relates to the difficulty. It no longer adds unnecessary conclusions that expand the burden, and so the effort remains within its proper boundary. Over time, this produces a different kind of stability. The caregiver still encounters the same events, but the internal response is less volatile, less dependent on outcome, and less likely to escalate into self-judgment. This is not because the person has become indifferent, but because they have become more exact in what they accept as true. If discipline is not established in this way, then understanding remains theoretical. The person knows where the error lies, but continues to repeat it because no new pattern has been built. And so the same cycle continues: impression, interpretation, assent, strain. The correction becomes practical only when it is made repeatable, because without a structure for action, the mind returns to its earlier habits even if it has understood the error. What matters is not occasional clarity, but whether the correction can be applied in the ordinary flow of the day, where most impressions arise and where most assent is given without notice. A simple structure begins with recognizing triggers. When a change in condition appears, when progress stalls, or when an unexpected difficulty emerges, this is the moment where the mind is most likely to add meaning quickly. Instead of allowing the interpretation to complete itself, the task is to insert a deliberate step, to name the event without extending it. This is the condition as it is, rather than this is what this means about me or my effort. This distinction is small in language but significant in effect, because it prevents the immediate merging of event and judgment. From there, the next action is to question ownership before responding. When a situation demands attention, the mind can be trained to ask, what part of this requires my action, and what part does not belong to my control? For example, a caregiver may notice that a routine is not producing the expected improvement. The actionable part may involve adjusting timing, seeking advice, or maintaining consistency. The non-actionable part is the outcome itself. By separating these, the response remains directed and contained, rather than expanding into concern over results that cannot be guaranteed. Another useful practice is the correction of interpretation after it has already begun. There will be moments where assent has already been given, and the emotional weight is present. In these cases, the task is not to deny the reaction, but to revisit the judgment that produced it. Instead of continuing under the assumption that the situation reflects inadequacy, the mind can return to the boundary: the effort was within your control, the outcome was not. This does not erase the reaction immediately, but it prevents it from being reinforced. Daily review also becomes a tool, not for self-criticism, but for clarification. At the end of the day, the caregiver can examine moments where strain increased and ask, where did I extend responsibility beyond what was mine? This question directs attention to the point of misjudgment rather than to the event itself. The aim is not to assign fault, but to identify where correction can be applied the next time a similar impression appears. It is equally important to recognize that fatigue itself can become another interpretation if left unexamined. Feeling tired after sustained effort is expected, but the added judgment, I cannot sustain this is too much to carry, can transform fatigue into a broader conclusion about one's capacity. When this happens, the same method applies: separate the physical state from the judgment about what it signifies, and respond to each appropriately. These practices do not remove difficulty or reduce the demands of care, but they prevent the accumulation of unnecessary burden that arises from misinterpretation. Each action remains connected to what can be governed, and each impression is given space before it becomes a fixed conclusion. Over time, this creates a different rhythm in the work itself. The caregiver is no longer moving from one moment to the next under a continuous sense of evaluation, but is instead engaging each situation within its own boundary. The work becomes segmented rather than continuous in its weight, because each part is handled without being carried forward as evidence of success or failure. If these practices are not applied, the same cycle continues: impressions are accepted without examination, responsibility expands beyond its proper limits, and the mind remains engaged in managing outcomes that do not respond to effort alone. This is what creates the sense of endless strain. What begins to change, once this practice stabilizes, is not the external situation but the internal position from which it is met, and this is where the idea of freedom must be corrected, because it is often misunderstood as relief from difficulty rather than a change in authority over one's own response. In long-term care, the external conditions remain uncertain, sometimes deteriorating, sometimes resistant to effort, and often indifferent to the consistency of care provided. If freedom were defined as the removal of these conditions, it would remain unattainable. But Stoic freedom is not located in the condition, it is located in the ruling faculty's independence from it. A caregiver who has corrected the boundary of responsibility, examined the mechanism of assent, and trained their response through repeated practice begins to experience a different form of stability. The same events occur: a setback, a difficult day, a lack of visible progress, but they no longer carry the same implication. They are no longer treated as verdicts about adequacy or signals of failure, because the mind has stopped assigning them that role. Consider two individuals performing the same actions over the same period. Both provide consistent care, both face similar challenges, and both encounter the same lack of control over outcomes. The difference emerges in how each relates to these events. One continues to interpret every result as a measure of personal effectiveness, and so each unfavorable outcome adds weight. The other maintains the distinction between action and outcome, and so each event remains within its proper category. The result is not that one avoids difficulty while the other suffers it, but that one multiplies the difficulty through interpretation while the other does not. This is the form of freedom available here, not the absence of strain, but the absence of unnecessary addition to strain. This freedom is not a final state that, once reached, remains secure without effort. It is maintained through the same practices that produced it. The mind must continue to examine impressions, to question interpretations, and to withhold assent where it does not belong. Without this maintenance, the previous patterns return, because they are familiar and require no effort to resume. It is also important to see that this form of freedom does not make the person detached in the sense of being indifferent or unresponsive. The caregiver continues to act, to adjust, to provide support, and to remain attentive. The difference is that these actions are no longer burdened by the demand that they produce a specific outcome. The care is given fully, but without the added expectation that it must resolve what is not within the caregiver's authority. Over time, this produces a steadier relation to the work itself. The days are no longer evaluated as successful or failed based on changes that could not be commanded. Instead, they are assessed by the consistency of response, the clarity of judgment, and the discipline of attention. This shift reduces the accumulation of strain, not by reducing effort, but by removing the additional layer that made the effort unsustainable. If this distinction is not maintained, the earlier pattern reasserts itself. The caregiver begins again to measure their adequacy against outcomes, to interpret stagnation as failure, and to carry forward each result as part of an ongoing judgment about their role. This is what erodes stability over time, not the work itself, but the continuous misassignment of meaning to what occurs. Freedom, then, is not found in changing the duration or difficulty of care, but in correcting the position from which care is given. It is the reduction of inward dependence on outcomes, and the restoration of authority to the point where judgment is formed. The problem was never the length of care, but the judgment that extended responsibility beyond its proper boundary, turning each action into a measure of what could never be controlled. When effort is tied to outcome, the mind places itself in a position where it must answer for what does not belong to it, and from this position, strain becomes inevitable over time. The correction has been consistent throughout. Distinguish what is yours from what is not, observe how impressions become judgments through unexamined assent, and train the mind to return responsibility to the point where authority actually exists. Care does not require you to govern outcomes, only to govern your response within them. When this distinction is maintained, the same work no longer accumulates into a continuous burden, because it is no longer carried forward as evidence of success or failure. Each action is completed within its own boundary, and the mind is not stretched across results it cannot command. Collapse is not the result of carrying too long, but of carrying what was never yours for too long. Return to what is yours to govern.